Hi everyone, and welcome to Washington Echoes, where we travel back through time. Washington is centrally located within the triangle of Newcastle, Sunderland and Durham in northeast England. Please subscribe now to keep updated with local history in and around the Washington area. I'm Audrey Fletcher, and I'm here today to share with you a short history of Brugeford Chapel, which stood on the River Wear near Pictree from Anglo-Saxon times, and was later immortalised in the legend of the Lambton Worm. It is due to its inclusion in the local legend of the Lambton Worm that Brugeford Chapel is well known. It was the Holy Sabbath. The matin bell was clanging in the old chapel by the Wear, where Lambton's siren son for many a year had made their solemn vows. The old chapel by the Wear, Brugeford Chapel on the Lambton estate, had been a major crossing of the River Wear for millennia, and a bridge had been standing there at least from medieval times. This same bridge was falling into disrepair in the mid-1500s and needed to be replaced. Hence the crossing was renamed New Bridge. The earliest written record of Brugeford Chapel was on the 19th of August in 1314, when Bishop Kellar recorded a regular presentation of John de Pampilsworth by Robert Lord of Lambton to the Chapel of Brugeford. The aerial photo at top right indicates the site of Brugeford Chapel today, while the painting at centre shows Brugeford, the new bridge and Lambton Castle on the hill. Brugeford Chapel would have been at the left of the painting behind the trees, but it had been pulled down by 1834. And finally, we see a sketch of the ruins of Brugeford Chapel itself. In 601 AD, it was decreed by Pope Gregory that Christian churches be built on sites which had been previously used for Celtic rituals and ceremonies. Brugeford was such a site. The Celtic goddess Brigantia, the guardian or protector of the pre-Roman Brigantes nation in northern England, was the divine spirit in the eternal cycle of creation, death and renewal, which was central to pagan belief. It was a belief not unlike that shared by the Christian Church, that of birth, death and resurrection, which would go towards explaining Pope Gregory's decision to use Celtic sacred sites. Brigeford or St. Bridget's Ford was an important river crossing, second only to Durham itself, which would have developed as a religious centre in prehistoric and later Brigantian eras. The tide going out to create a ford would have seemed like the intervention of the gods, allowing the people to cross over the watery spiritual realm of their ancestors. Upon reaching the other side, they would have given thanks in the form of prayers and offerings at a sacred shrine, which through time developed into Brugeford Chapel. Our story of how Christianity came to Brugeford begins on the island of Iona in the Inner Hebrides, where Oswald, who afterwards became King of Northumbria with his capital at Bamborough, learned about Christianity at the monastery of Columba. However, it was only after his defeat of the Welsh at Hexham in 634 that he converted to Christianity. In the following year, King Oswald invited Aidan, a monk on Iona, to become a missionary for Christianity in Northumbria. Aidan chose Lindisfarne as the site for his church and monastery. At high tide it became an island the same size as Iona, and it was within sight of Bamborough. Lindisfarne was the cradle of Christianity in Northumberland and Durham, and it was here that St Aidan and St Cuthbert founded their monasteries. Aidan had been born in Connaught Island. His name Aidan means little fiery one, and in the photo to the left he is seen carrying a flaming torch, often referred to as his ice cream cone. Christianity flourished under Aidan's leadership. He died in 651 and was later made a saint. "23 years later, in 674 and then in 682, Egfrith, the new king of Northumbria, granted land to Abbot Benedict Bishop to build the first stone monasteries in England at Monk Wearmouth and Jarrow, St Peter's and St Paul's. Bishop was an Anglo-Saxon Northumbrian nobleman who, after his second visit to St Peter's in Rome, went to Lorraine, took his monastic vows under the rule of St Benedict, and adopted the name of Benedict. The monasteries were built by masons from Francia, brought over by Abbot Benedict, as England had no stonemasons. Monk Wearmouth and Jarrow monasteries became centres of learning and religion, and Abbot Benedict, who was a mentor of the Venerable Bede, died in 690. Like St Aidan and St Cuthbert, he was also made a saint. At top left is a cutaway view of Constantine's St Peter's Basilica in the Vatican City, as it looked in the 4th century. The architecture goes a long way in explaining why stone-built Anglo-Saxon churches in England, like that of St Paul's at Jarrow at bottom right, were generally tall and narrow. As previously mentioned, the decree had come down from Pope Gregory in 601 to build Christian churches on previous Celtic religious sites, with the result that Bishop Benedict founded St Peter's in 673 at Monk Wearmouth, where there also happened to be a ready supply of Roman building materials. This was the result of the Romans also having built their forts on or near Celtic religious sites and settlements. After all, Celtic sites were often in great locations, near to rivers and river crossings, water being an important element in their spiritual belief, and handy for the Romans to make reuse of the Celtic ready-made tracks and roadways. Like St Paul's at Jarrow, Brugeford Chapel was single cell, but also it had much in common with St Paul's at Jarrow, St Peter's at Monk Wearmouth, and also Escombe Church. All were built using materials from local forts, all had small Roman windows in the south wall, all had Roman coins down the side of the wall. It was believed that the Christian church was Roman. Therefore, a masonry church was a Roman building. In the top two photos, compare the Roman Anglo-Saxon doorway and coins from St Peter's, Monk Wearmouth 673, and the rectangle window from Hough on the Hill with Brugeford Chapel. They are virtually identical. Brugeford Chapel on the River Wear was a beautiful single-cell chapel. The arched doorway, the rectangular window, and the coins down the southeast corner wall indicating an early Anglo-Saxon origin. I would suggest the late 600s, possibly about 685, following the completion of St Paul's at Jarrow. It had uncomplicated architecture and Roman stonework, but, most importantly, it was in close proximity to St Peter's Monastery, just along the River Wear at Monk Wearmouth. As early stone churches came under the jurisdiction of monasteries, Brugeford Chapel would have been Benedictine, attached to the Monk Wearmouth Jarrow Benedictine Monastery, possibly the first in Durham, and predating Escombe Church. Brugeford Chapel was built using the same traditional methods as Monk Wearmouth Jarrow. Very probably the same Francia builders brought over by Abbot Benedict in 674 were used. The building materials were readily available from Picktree Fort, just across the River Wear about half a mile up the road and on the left-hand side, and also from Chestley Street Fort. Picktree is an ancient settlement boasting a Neolithic henge, an Iron Age village, a Roman fort, a Roman farm, and a Roman settlement. Indeed, St. Bridget's Ford would have held great sacred significance, dating back as early as the Neolithic age. The photos down the centre of the screen trace the development of the Picktree site from the Neolithic age down through the Iron Age to the Roman occupation. Brugeford Chapel was in decline as early as 1737, as indicated on Burley and Thompson's map at top right. The roof had long gone, but notice also how the chapel is in the shape of a square. However, in 1785, Hutchinson observed that, at a farmhouse leading to Lambton are the remains of a chapel. The stonework of the eastern window is yet perfect. I wonder what happened to this window. Then, almost 50 years later, in 1834, Sir Cuthbert Sharp recounted that the shell of this little oratory lately stood near the New Bridge, on the left of the road, immediately within the entrance of Lambton Park. It was still standing in 1800 when the following sketch was made. However, by 1834, when Sir Cuthbert Sharp was relating the Worm legend in the Bishopric Garland, Brugeford Chapel had been pulled down, which indicates that Brugeford Chapel was demolished at some time between 1800 and 1834. I created this reconstruction of Brugeford Chapel, which was built of materials from the nearby Roman forts of Picktree and possibly Chestley Street, from the sketch dated 1800. It is noticeably taller than it appears in the sketch, and has a square floor area as indicated on the earlier 1737 map. In fact, it appears to be a perfect cube, representing the Holy of Holies in King Solomon's Temple in Jerusalem. This would have made it among the most sacred of Anglo-Saxon religious buildings in England. Being a chapel used for prayer and not a church used for worship, I wonder what holy relic was kept there. I would suggest that Escombe Church also had associations with the Temple of Jerusalem, significantly both having a 3:1 ratio floor area. However, although the floor of the chancel at Escombe was in the shape of a square, it was not, unfortunately, of the same height to form a cube, the Holy of Holies. In my reconstruction of Brugeford Chapel, notice the Roman arched doorway, coins, rectangular window, and general building stones, just as in the sketch. I also constructed the roof in the Roman style to complete the building. After all, it was believed that the Christian church was Roman, and therefore a masonry church was a Roman building. As outlined earlier, my calculated building date is the late 600s, possibly about 685, following the completion of St. Paul's Monastery at Jarrow and preceding Escombe Church, due to Brugeford Chapel being in close proximity to St. Peter's Monastery, just along the River Wear at Monk Wearmouth. This was a beautiful and perfectly proportioned building. It is such a shame it was pulled down rather than renovated in the early 1800s. Well everyone, I hope that you have enjoyed this presentation and subscribed to my channel. I look forward to sharing my continued research into Washington history with you in my next video. Bye for now.